Good evening, boys and ghouls. Welcome back to the channel. I am your humble host D, your guide through the winding tunnels of horror history. Tonight we take a look at the 60s, which in many ways were more complex and at the same time more playful than the previous decade. Stylistically speaking, the 60s were all over the place, but most important for us when discussing horror is probably the retro-gothic trend, which built on the aesthetics of the 30s golden age, but often grittier and updated for then modern audiences. You'll soon see what I mean. Now, let's move on to the list. Last Man on Earth is a proto-zombie movie, if you will, a forerunner of what was soon to come. The story sounds familiar to most modern viewers. A virulent plague sweeps the earth and the affected turn into vampires or something of that nature. A single person is left unaffected, being as far as he knows the last surviving human, and we get to follow his struggle to stay sane in this bleak reality. The titular Last Man is played by Vincent Price, a name that you will hear a few times tonight, as he's by far the most iconic and prolific actor of the genre at this time. The movie is based on the Richard Matheson novel I Am Legend, which has been adapted to the screen a few times, most notably in 2007 with Will Smith in the role, but none of them leave quite as haunting an impact as this one. Little Shop of Horrors. Like many movies of the era, there's an 80s remake of this that people are more familiar with, but the original deserves some recognition too. Created by the legendary B-movie director Roger Corman, this is a dark, comedic tale about a florist who cultivates a strange meat-eating plant and eventually is driven to kill in order to keep his budding pets alive. Worth mentioning is a then still unknown Jack Nicholson in a minor role as a masochist dentist's patient.
Oh my god, don't stop now!
Little Shop of Horrors is humble and unassuming, but understandably a cult classic. The Pit and the Pendulum, based on the tale of Edgar Allan Poe, was also directed by Roger Corman, just a year after The Little Shop of Horrors, to illustrate the diversity of his portfolio. The story concerns a man investigating the mysterious death of his sister, who was married to the son of a cruel inquisitor. The grieving widower is played by Vincent Price in his signature role of tormented aristocrat. Just as noteworthy, though, is British actress Barbara Steele, who is something of a cult favorite among horror buffs. The Pit and the Pendulum is entertaining and cozy in that autumn kind of way, a shining example of the retro-gothic style of the 60s. Written and directed by Koneto Shindo, one of Japan's most prolific filmmakers, Onibaba is a dark historical horror drama loosely based on a Buddhist fable. Set in the war-torn 14th century, it's the story of two women, an older widow and her daughter-in-law, who survive in a vast field by ambushing samurai and selling their belongings for food. Central to the movie is the deep pit in the middle of the field where the women dispose of their victims, which also serves as a metaphor for the depravity and mental darkness of the characters. Onibaba is a tale of lust, greed and jealousy, but also a study of desperation and grim necessities. It's dark and disturbing, and it will haunt your dreams. Masque of the Red Death. It's Edgar Allan Poe, it's Roger Corman, and yes, it's Vincent Price. This is the tale of an egoistic aristocrat who throws a frivolous party in the safety of his castle while the plague ravages the poor countryside. Doesn't work out too well in the end though. Social distancing, buddy. The movie is a veritable orgy of vibrant colors and theatrical surroundings. Everything looks a bit like stage props and set dressings, but you also get the feeling that this is a deliberate choice, as to illustrate the artificial world of the detached upper class. Masque of the Red Death. Good movie. Strange movie. Carnival of Souls. This is a dark, artsy film about a woman who is the sole survivor of a car accident, only to find herself in a bleak and dreary shadow of reality, a kind of psychological no man's land between the worlds of the living and the dead. She is haunted by visions of ghost-like people and is inexplicably drawn to a pavilion at an abandoned amusement park. It's difficult to talk about Carnival of Souls without giving away too much or over-explaining the plot. Suffice it to say, it's not your fun, easygoing kind of horror, but rather a stylistic nightmare that is well worth sitting through at least once. The Masque of Satan was the directing debut of Mario Bava, and interestingly only the third Italian horror film ever produced in the sound era. The movie was made with an international cast and, from what I can tell, intended to be in English, but like Italian cinema in general at the time, all the sound was done in post, including the dialogue. If you can get past the somewhat shoddy dubbing though, you'll find a stunningly gothic tale of witches and vampires, with some scenes that are honestly kinda hardcore even today. This was Barbara Steele's breakthrough movie, and she plays both the ancient witch and her living descendant. She can feel a bit stiff at times, but generally she gives a very memorable performance. If you see this, I strongly recommend getting the uncut version. I first saw the censored international release known as Black Sunday, and it's a lot tamer. In its real form though, Masque of Satan is dark, grim and absolutely unforgettable. Witchfinder General is a movie that some might not consider to be horror, but screw those people. This is a genuinely disturbing tale of the English witch trials of the 17th century, loosely based on the real-life story of Matthew Hopkins, who used the ongoing panic to gain power and status for himself. Hopkins is portrayed here by the current MVP of the genre, Vincent Price, in what many consider one of his best roles. In some places, including the United States, the movie was released under the title The Conqueror Worm, in an attempt to hitch a ride on Price's success as an actor of Poe stories. However, Witchfinder General has nothing to do with Edgar Allan Poe and can stand just fine on its own merits. Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock's most famous work is potentially the most analyzed and dissected movie in cinema history. Even if you watch it for the first time, it is basically impossible to enter the story without preconceptions. Who has never heard of the famous shower scene or is unfamiliar with the twist ending? It is in many ways a forerunner to the slasher subgenre, which was still several years away. Just like the slashers would be, Psycho was highly controversial, and Hitchcock almost had to go out of his way to add superfluous explanations and reservations to calm his critics and censors. All said, Psycho is indeed a masterpiece, and its legacy remains to this day. Psycho is indeed a tough movie to beat, but before we move on to the top spot, here's a few honorable mentions. First, a 2-for-1. Peeping Tom and Eyes Without a Face were both released the same year as Psycho, and like it, they were criticized to no end. Of the three, Hitchcock's career was the only one to survive the outcry, although the other two have been rightfully posthumously acknowledged. Speaking of Hitchcock, one of his defining films was The Birds, that was on and off my list a few times. It's a good movie and iconic enough that you almost owe yourself to have seen it. Finally, Rosemary's Baby is one of those movies that have always been talked about but never really stuck with me personally. It's definitely not a terrible movie though, so feel free to judge for yourself. Now to finish off the list. At number 1 we find a movie that came out of left field and pretty much changed everything. Night of the Living Dead. George A. Romero's movie debut, made on a minimal budget, is one of the biggest trendsetters in horror history. It was the definite start of the zombie subgenre, even though the groundwork was laid 37 years earlier with White Zombie. Also, it owes quite a bit to The Last Man on Earth, which we mentioned earlier. The movie takes place during the early days of a zombie outbreak, and follows a group of people who barricade themselves in a house where they have to learn to cooperate in order to survive. Like most modern zombie flicks, the story is more about human interaction than it is about the living dead. If you haven't seen it yet, it is easily accessible. It slipped into the public domain a while back due to a copyright blunder and is legally available on places like YouTube. Night of the Living Dead was groundbreaking for several reasons. It changed horror movies and cinema in general for the better in ways that still just won't die. And that was my pick for the top 10 horror movies of the 60s. Next time we move on to the 70s, and that's where things really start getting funky. Thanks for watching, catch you on the flip side.